This presentation is a kind of not really work in progress, but a kind of theme that I've returned to multiple times in the past few years. And I was surprised initially to find that there's a kind of a specific group of texts that appear in the Dunhuang, among the Dunhuang manuscripts, which are all from roughly the same period, that would be late 9th to early 10th century, and texts that deal with Buddhist forms of meditation in a way that is most easily identified as visualization practices, as we know from mainstream esoteric Buddhism, or what is sort of generally called Mijiao in the Chinese context. To be honest, I should basically also be dealing with Tibetan Buddhist practices, because there's a sort of confluence or a conflation of these different meditation practices in Dunhuang that incorporate both elements from early Tibetan Buddhism and from Chinese Buddhism. But for this material I will present today is based on Chinese texts. So to jump into it, meditation is not only visualization practices, that is things similar to what we have already heard about today, but encompasses a vast variety of Buddhist meditation practices. Some of them are not at all dealing with visual experiences, some are to some extent doing it, and some are not at all. So therefore we have a broad range of materials from the Dunhuang corpus that actually in various ways highlight the popularity and the importance of Buddhist meditation practices, very broadly speaking. Below you will see here just a listing of some of the more common terms that we find connected to the idea of meditation, and they are listed below here. I don't need to read them to you, but you can just see them, and you know, if somebody wants to have a specific idea what is appearing where, we can talk about that in the question section. What is important is, though, that sometimes the traditions, they are using all of these terminologies. So in the same text you can actually have multiple uses of these terms, and of course they are specific in the sense that once the material pops up in more sectarian context, like in Chan Buddhism, or in the case of Chentai Buddhism, we usually have, or we should be aware that there are special soteriological and also interpretive structures behind it. So that means that the same term can actually appear in different contexts with slightly different or sometimes radically different meanings. So moving on to the different categories of meditative practices that we find in the Chinese Dunhuang material, we have I have here ordered it according to which types of meditation practices we find. This is not a complete listing, but it's like a kind of a general listing that you can more or less be sure of, you can identify in the material. We have Pure Land visualization. This is dealing with the cult of Amitabha, the Western Pure Land of Sukhavati, and these are visualization practices that are based both on canonical and non-canonical scriptures. And the material goes back quite well before the Tang Dynasty, so it's part of an early tradition, and it probably links up with some of the meditation texts or meditation scriptures that were presented by Venerable Pra in his presentation. So we have a fairly early group of meditation texts. Sometimes they're called meditation sutras, which is a little bit loose in my opinion, but I mean, that's more or less, that roughly covers it, and that go back at least to the 3rd century BC, Common Era, sorry. So contemplative practices of various kinds, they can involve analytical thinking or conceptual thinking, analytical meditation. And actually we have already encountered a lot of that. You know, meditations on impurity, that can be just thinking about the body's impurities or the impurities of samsara or that kind of thing. Or they can be factual, that one meditates on a decomposing body, for instance, which is a standard meditation practice that we find in the early material, Buddhist material. Then there are meditation on the sense organs. These are also, in a certain way, transcending the Theravada Mahayana divide, and you find them, of course, differently interpreted, but basically we have some of the same ideas. And of course, one important type is Avalokiteshvara's contemplation of the organ of hearing, which is based on the Sudo Surangama Sutra, Yan Shou Yan Jing. So from that, we have a series of more Chan Buddhist forms of meditation, and they are even including non-meditation. This is something that's important to understand when we deal about Buddhist meditation, and you can have meditation that is not meditation. And this is something that is it's probably a Mahayana type innovation, but it becomes highly radicalized in the Chinese Buddhist context. Then there are the esoteric or tantric Buddhist visualizations. I've grouped these two things together just for practical reasons, because they are, how can I say, in terms of method or technique, they are following by and large the same procedure. However, esoteric Buddhism is a sort of pre-state to tantric Buddhism in my understanding of Buddhist history. So it's important to understand that those techniques are exist over extended periods of time. And of course, ultimately, a lot of the visualization stuff here actually derives from the early material, that is from the meditation scriptures that we heard about earlier. So even if we have in Dunhuang, we have sectarian formats, that means structures of different Buddhist schools, they were actually not so orthodox as one would expect it, and it's surely not comparable quite the same way as mainstream Buddhism in China. So there's a tendency in the Dunhuang material that meditation practices were quite widespread in different forms and were practiced by individual practitioners in, among others, in the dwellers in the caves. There were special caves in Dunhuang where meditators were living, and many of those practices were probably conducted in solitary seclusion. If we talk about the texts themselves from Dunhuang that deal with visualization, and I'm now talking specifically about the material that deals with esoteric practices, we can see there are certain things in common. Often they are short, condensed, and abbreviated. And we know this because many of them, they actually are lifted from longer canonical or ritual texts. So we know how from the Dunhuang material, we can see how Buddhists on the ground were sort of taking the text out and making them into easier to use practical material. And we have the excerpted purposes. They could sometimes function as a sort of shorthand and would probably require the practitioner to know the larger ritual in detail. But often these things were, again, for practical reasons, and also probably were cheaper. Often these texts can be found in manuscripts that are personal compilations or manuals consisting of multiple texts, some of which may not be directly linked to esoteric Buddhism. So there are some compendia that are extending beyond a sectarian format to actually encompass many different things. So We know again that these manuals or these compilations were sometimes transmitted, and because we have found several copies of texts that are, if not entirely identical, then at least share many of the same core texts, even the abbreviated ones. So the selection of text in these composite manuscripts reflect on several Buddhist forms of practice. They tend to reflect ritual, liturgical, and poetical didactic concerns. That means that there can be, there can actually be chant Buddhist poems inserted in these manuscripts together with the esoteric Buddhist rituals. The primary elements in esoteric Buddhist visualization consist of a mental construction of an idealized imagined world. So it's clear that the meditator is not just sitting down and having a vision, sort of a random vision or a specific vision, but in the meditation on the navel that we heard about before, it's something that the practitioner is concerned. He's sort of building his own inner world of vision. So it's an inner vision that is in a certain way transposed or out of himself to encompass the whole world. So there's a close correspondence in these practices between vision and sound. That means, and movement actually. So the three mysteries in esoteric Buddhism, body, speech, and mind, are played out in the course of the ritual and in the course of the visualization. So it's not necessarily a case where the practitioner is sitting still for 2 hours and not moving or anything like that. He can be doing things with his body at the same time, and he will chant spells with his mouth. So in Samadhi, as understood in this tradition here, there's no separation between the constructed world of the visualization and the perceived reality. So there's no, actually, it's up to the practitioner to create the world in a certain way. Everything is at the same time real and at the same time an illusionist play. And because of that, it's the situation is a malleable one from the perspective of the practitioner. The practitioner must be empowered in order to perform the given visualization, because the visualization, which is part of the rite itself, also means that the person has authority and is able to conduct it. His vision is a sort of going from just being imagined to an actual realization of a concrete effect. So this takes place partly via a ritual consecration, whereby the practitioner is empowered by his teacher, and then he has to uphold certain ritual taboos and precepts in order to be functioning as a proper master himself. In Dunhuang, we find interesting that it's the practice of visualization often is accompanied by repentance. So this is a sort of a prerequisite for performing, is that you have to purify yourself before you actually engage in visual practice. There are a bunch of different texts that I would like to point out to, and they are listed here. I don't need to read them for you, but it's just to show that what is contained in these texts. And visualization is consisting not only of visions of Buddhas or pure lands or so, but it can also be can also feature seed syllable visualization. That means Sanskrit bija syllables that are used in the visualization. And usually these letters, these magical letters, they are transforming into deities, or you go back into the letter again. And so you can both sort of expand and collapse the visualization according to the need. Spells for securing the ritual space. This is an important type of ritual. It's not a ritual in itself, but it's a ritual aspect or ritual element. that before you start your practice, you have to make the altar a sacred altar, and that happens through this a ritual of empowerment, whereby you cordon off the space. You are planting different kinds of banners and so forth to sort of indicate that this is a ritual space. The Manjushri meditation is a text that it gives itself. It's of course focusing on the Bodhisattva Manjushri, and it is a 5-syllable spell, which also both appears as a series of syllables, but also as a visualization from which the Bodhisattva emanates. We have Vajragarbha's mantra for counting beads that also includes a seed syllable visualization of the bija seeds. And again, you see the counting beads is of course the prayer beads that are used for mantras in ritual practice. We have a Trikaya visualization, and we have salvational rites. This is a category that's quite common actually, and it sort of conflates the next one on the list, the food distribution and salvation of the hungry ghost. They are conflated with also salvaging the beings in the 6 realms. So it's a kind of combined type of practice. This is a salvific practice that is quite common in the Dunhuang material. And then one last element. I mean, this is not a complete listing, but it gives you an idea of the variety of ritual aspects that can take place. It's the greatly gathering Vajrapala of the eastern direction, and is usually connected to Akshobhya, the wrathful form of Akshobhya Buddha, one of the 5 Dhyana Buddhas. So one form of esoteric practice that became highly important in late medieval Dunhuang and popular as well was a law and belief concerning the deliverance of the hungry ghosts, those unfortunate beings reborn in that tormented destiny. I will not review the extensive material connected to these elaborate rituals, except to note the number of extant manuscripts from Cave 17 that relate to this type of ritual is quite extensive. So extensive, in fact, that it leaves us in little or no doubt that the related ritual practice must have been highly important in among Dunhuang's Buddhist community. One reason for this is that the salvation of the hungry ghost, in effect, an extension of the liberation of those beings reborn in the hells of the netherworld, played directly into prevailing ancestor beliefs, as well as fear of evil rebirths and the consequences of retribution for evil karma. As with many other aspects relating to esoteric Buddhism in Dunhuang during the late medieval period, the figure of Amoghavajra, a major esoteric Buddhist Acharya in the Tang dynasty, stands out in many of the texts. And we see that also in these texts for feeding the hungry ghosts. And this is because he has connected with the translation of at least one sutra, but with several ritual texts that are, if not by him, then at least associated with his name. Given the impact of his writing, of Amoghavajra's writings on the development of esoteric Buddhism in Dunhuang, it is not surprising to see aspects of this in the food offerings performed by local Buddhists during the period following the Tibetan occupation. Indeed, Amoghavajra's name figures prominently in the related manuscripts, although it is in many cases found in connection with abridged or modified texts, an example of which will follow below. So here we have one of the texts. I've made a synopsis of most of it, and at the end there will be a translated passage just to show how it works. As a way of illustrating how such food offerings took place, I've selected the Sanshilfa taken from a small personal compilation in the form of a booklet. It's a booklet I've worked with before. Given that the text runs into some 57 lines of roughly 20 characters per line, it is not the place to providing a full translation here. What I will do is to summarize it, as I said. And according to information provided by Professor Galambos, the booklet dates from around 900. He has worked with several of these small private manuals that probably the monks carry in their sleeves or something like that, and they have sort of condensed ritual text or text in combination. Sometimes excerpts from sutras, sometimes ritual programs. The Sanskrit begins with a traditional description of the ritual agents for which it was composed, namely the good men and women, monks and nuns, laymen and lay women, who seek to cultivate Buddhism, and in doing so wish to bestow food. And the food bestowal is usually on the hungry ghosts or on people who are the deceased who may be suffering in hell. The text then mentions that there are two types of meditation for this procedure, an inner one and an outer one. This also echoes some of the concerns we have met with before today, namely that there are the two aspects of the Buddha's outside and the Buddha's inside. And this idea of inner and outer one is, of course, a way to transcend the duality of inside and outside. Method for purification of the Dharmakaya purification is an important opening part. It involves a series of esoteric Buddhist divinities that are invoked, including Akashagarbha, the demon general Atavaka, and the Vajra Kroda Amita Kundalin, and Chintamani Avalokiteshvara. These are all sort of common figures that appear in the esoteric material found in Dunhuang. All of these ritual gestures are accompanied by spells and mudras for the subjugation of all suffering demons, spirits, yakshas, etc. It's interesting to see that in a certain way there's a fear of the hungry ghosts who may cause problems for human beings. At the same time, there's also a compassion for them so that people would, the practitioners would want to liberate them from that state of unfortunate rebirth. So there's offering to all of the six paths, that is, as I said before, the six destinies that you can be reborn in. Food offerings to evil beings, including, again, the demons and the hungry ghosts, and mantras and mudras are to be used in conjunction. So it's a whole program, and so the visualization goes on tandem with the use of the hand gestures, the mudras, and the chanting of the mantras. Practice of contemplation. This constitutes an interesting type of visualization in which the practitioner's body become a de facto mandala, or conceptualized as a process in which the entire esoteric Buddhist pantheon is being transposed onto his or her body. So this again echoes a little bit what we have seen before. These are specific Buddhist divinities that appear as positioned in the body. So they are to be visualized in various parts of the practitioner's body from the crown of the head and on down. The process is color-coded and have other symbolic features in line with the format of the internal visualization. Accompanying this passage are a pair of injunctions. First, to the effect that a person cultivating this must be someone who has embraced the great vehicle and should contemplate that his very body is the body of the Buddha. So here we have the Buddha nature actualized in the practitioner, not as an internal thing, but as a de facto thing. So the practitioner, he goes from, in the ritual process, he goes from being an ordinary Buddhist practitioner on to a Buddha or another divinity, depending on the context. The second injunction appears at the end of the passage and warns the practitioner to keep the proceedings secret in order to avoid having strange things happen. And this is, of course, typical of esoteric Buddhism, that you're not allowed to disclose the finer aspects of the practice to people who are considered unworthy. And then follows the Mahayana visualization, and I have it in bracket as a Da Cheng Guan Xiang. And this involves the purification of the three karmas, that of body, speech, and mind, as I mentioned previously. In connection with the appropriate mantra that should be uttered, as the practitioner visualizes all of empty space constituting the Dharma Dhatu filled by Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. This is to be accompanied by prostrations while chanting mentally. This phase in the ritual process may be understood as an act of repentance, as I also mentioned previously. So then you chant the mantra for making the offerings, and then there's a whole list of the offerings that are to be given to the hungry ghosts or the suffering beings, including flowers, incense, and food offerings. And then the final visualization. Afterwards, you should regulate your body and mind. Sit correctly in meditation with erect body and visualize that your body emanates a great bright light which illuminates those who suffer in the 3 mayas in the 10 directions, as well as in the courts of the netherworld. From above, the right eyebrow send forth a ray of milky white light which illuminates all of the heavens. Surely all who undergo hardships and suffering will be released. From the left eyebrow issue forth a ray of white light that illuminates all humans in the world of the 10 directions. From below the right ribs issue forth a ray of white light that illuminates all domestic animals. So there's this kind of the 6 destinies are sort of liberated through this self visualization, where forth your transformed body is able to send out rays to liberate. And this goes, with human beings and gods and so forth. And then in the end, from below the left knee issue forth a ray of warm light which illuminates the 8 cold hells. Sentient beings who suffer there will surely be reborn as gods without a single one remaining. All of those suffering beings visualize that their bodies are identical with those of all the Buddhas. This then are our true bodies, and beyond that, nothing else. So here, at the end of the rite, you actually have saved everybody in the world. All the suffering beings are now brought on the right path and are essentially Buddhas. From these examples, it should be clear that no matter what otherwise takes place in the practice of visualization in these texts, it is the meditative aspect that guides the manner of their primary purposes and intents. However, one should by no means understand the visualization, which is with its focus on meditative concentration, as the only element which makes up the ritual practices in which they occur. While visualization and contemplation are the primary elements in a given ritual process, they do not stand alone. Various visualizations discussed here are, in the majority of cases, being accompanied by the chanting of spells and the forming of ritual hand gestures, mudras. When understood thus, the visualization and contemplation as practiced in esoteric Buddhist rituals are not to be conceived of as similar to the manner of meditation that is being conducted in other Buddhist meditative systems, such as those practiced in the Chentai and Chan schools, where more abstract and prolonged forms of introspection and quiet contemplations are being taught. Similarly, it is evident that the manner in which meditative absorption is and was understood and actualized in Sinitic Esoteric Buddhism in comparison with so-called Southern Buddhism, that is Theravada, is in fact vastly different. This is not only to be observed in the way meditation itself was being performed, but is in particular evident in the former's formulation of the underlying soteriological process and its doctrinal context. The Buddhist path in esoteric Buddhism is on many levels representative of an inclusive holistic vision, one that encompasses the physical universe in all its diversity. This underscores the idea that samsara and nirvana are not to be understood as separate entities on the absolute level of insight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henrik, for this insightful talk. And then I think we open the floor for discussion. Yes, Kate.
Henrik, could you say a bit about the meditation caves at Dunhuang? You mentioned caves that are specific for meditation.
In Dunhuang itself, at the place called the Mogao, which is the assortment of this famous system of caves that were created from the 4th century and until let's say, the Mongol period. It's the 14th century, more or less. there are two sections of these caves. There's a big section in the southern part, which is full of caves for worship, basically. I mean, they are ornate, highly decorated. There are famous wall paintings there in all of them, and they have altars and so forth for practice. So these are, how can I say, the place where people go to worship, burn incense and light lamps and these things. And then in the northern part, there are caves for habitation. And in these caves of habitation, some of these caves were sort of single cells, a little bit similar to what we see in India, in the Deccan in particular, where we have several of these monk cells with a single bed and a door and a little window and a place for an oil lamp or something like that. And these kind of caves have been found there in the northern caves of Dunhuang, which were, until a few, 2 decades ago, were filled with sand. And they were excavated, and they found a lot of things in these caves that were like personal belongings, ritual objects, and also fragments of texts. So it's in these caves that most would agree that there were practices going on here on an individual basis. Some people have called these caves, some of these caves, for burial caves, and I suppose that in some cases they were also, because once the practitioner or the person who lived in the cave died, he could have been entombed in this cave. One will have to imagine or know that in the Gobi Desert, the scarcity of wood would have been very limited. I mean, it would have been very limited with wood for funerary pyres. So I don't think it was very common that monks or nuns were actually burned after they died. So yeah, I've written a piece about these meditation practitioners in Dunhuang, and that's available online actually. So anybody can check it out.
Okay, thank you. Other questions, comments? Yes, Dylan.
Thank you, Henry, for this wonderful presentation.
Can you speak up, maybe? I'm not
Oh, yeah.
sure how well.
The question is about the outer and inner modes of presenting offerings to the pretas. So is the inner mode like more essentialized? I'm asking because in the Tibetan context, it's often the case when you have an outer practice and an inner practice. The inner practice is then a very short version of the longer practice. I was just wondering whether the same applies in this material.
Yeah, actually, one could say that the inner practice is sometimes privileged over the outer practice, but I think that could be also a practical concern, that it was simply in esoteric Buddhist ritual practice, it's actually quite expensive, and it would require sponsors, or it would acquire considerable offerings in order to be carried out according to the letter of the book. So I think that there are one text I translated some years ago deals with visualization practice, where it's said that you don't need to do any mantras or any mudras or anything. You just sit in meditation and you visualize the whole thing, including the offerings. So everything becomes an internalized process. But I think that it was most common to have the combination of an inner and outer type of the ritual taking place. So you had an altar, you had fruits or foodstuffs presented, incense and lamps and so forth. And then you had at the same time the practitioner or the ritual leader, he was visualizing how they were giving the food to the suffering pretas and so forth. So I think that type was more common, but I have seen texts where they say you don't need to do all that because the mental procedure or the mental ritual itself is enough.
Okay, other questions? Actually, I have a question. You mentioned in the beginning the Tibetans in Dunhuang, and I was wondering, I mean, my impression is that many of these concrete practices say in the 9th and 10th century, they were quite fluidly moving between Tibetans and Chinese, at least based on the text that we see. Are there any Tibetan texts that can, as far as you know, of course, that can shed light on the practices we see from the Chinese text?
Yeah, there are some, and actually in the same little handbook that I was discussing here, there is also a text that I identify as a tantric text coming from the Indo-Tibetan tradition, and that's on the taking of the vows of the samayas, and that's for sure a Tibetan text, although it's given in Chinese, but because we found several texts in the Tibetan language that are basically the same. So I think Sampanskaik and also Dalton has worked with this material earlier. So, but then there are some, I mean, I talked about esoteric Buddhism and tantric Buddhism as two, I mean, very close related religious phenomena of Buddhism, but also two distinct historical traditions and also culturally distinct. And in Dunhuang, we have some cases of the Tibetan texts that are, how can I say, they contain transgressive practices, and generally the Chinese texts, they avoid this. So they are more, how can I say, civilized in an East Asian context, whereas the other ones are more Indic, and those that pass through Tibet, they have these kind of offerings, and they mention human sacrifice, and they mention sexual practices in connection with the rites. And this is something we don't find in the Chinese material. So we can be more or less sure that where they belong if we categorize them according to soteriological structure, then we can see that they fall into different levels. So how can I say, the crossover is not too great with that kind of material, whereas with the food offerings and with the salvation of hungry ghosts, and so I think it's a little bit more fluid because it doesn't involve these transgressive practices.
All right, thank you very much. And we have an online question from Kathy Cantwell. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. That's just to add to this this current discussion. I'd just add that in what you're saying, I think because obviously, because I've worked with some of those Dunhuang tantric Tibetan materials, and I was seeing some interesting parallels with what you've been discussing. And one thing which really occurred to me is something which, of course, is very central in the Tibetan tantric tradition, is these tantric feast rites, which were, of course, a bit different from the sort of offerings for hungry ghosts and so on. But they have some similar features, including integrated into them, you have these kind of repentance type practices and so on, which is all part of it. And actually, you do the recitations at the same time as you make prostrations and light butter lamps and so on and so forth. So that actually sounded very similar. Just one sort of footnote on something you just said, and I'm not sure where you got it from, but the thing about human sacrifice, I wonder if you picked up on Dalton's book, which I think that's just a complete misreading of one of the rituals, one of the Drolwa or sort of liberation rituals.
Oh, I agree with what you say. I think actually I was talking a little bit out of place because it's not food offering, human sacrifice. It's human flesh in the sacraments of the food offering, and that's of course something else than the.
Exactly.
Although I do know that there was human sacrifices in some temples in Tibet, actually, in connection with consecration of buildings and things like that. So, but that's from a different period, and it's probably a different context also. So, but no, it's you're right. There's no documented text that I saw, at least, that speaks of human sacrifice in the text in Dunhuang. And there is one important abadabai with regard to the Tibetan material from Dunhuang, and it is we do not know exactly where it came from. The sort of localization of Tibetan Buddhism in Dunhuang is a big question still. And we don't, for the period of the occupation, we are more or less in place with what was going on. But for the more transgressive material that comes later, we haven't really localized a community of tantric practitioners with a Tibetan Buddhist sort of inclination that we can clearly talk about. We only have the texts, and they don't unfortunately contain much in terms of historical information about a local community or local communities. And I'm sure there were some, and I'm sure that they were there for quite some time, probably extending beyond the period of Chinese control, but we just don't really know about it.
Okay, great. So no human sacrifices, good news. And with this, we're going to end this panel, or this session, first session of this panel, and we're going to take a break. Refreshments for you guys at home as well, I guess. And we'll meet again at 4:15 Cambridge time. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.